why did you choose the history of smallpox as an object lesson for this time? And how do you think it's going to speak and to whom?
Yeah, so I suppose I should sort of start with my own background in kind of vaccines and science, which is absolutely nothing, right? I had one lesson, I think, when I was about 13 years old about vaccines, which was told the very kind of usual story of kind of Dr. Edward Jenner here in England, noticed that people who got cowpox didn't get smallpox, and hey presto, had the brilliant idea to come up with a vaccine. And that was sort of all I knew about it. But when you're investigating a conspiracy theory community, you need to just sort of by virtue of kind of investigating their claims, you begin to pick up a lot more because you have to understand what they're saying is wrong. So I began to research a lot about vaccines, and in particular, I was very interested in the kind of history of vaccines because I was interested in how, just things like the kind of abuses of vaccines, and how this stuff can get used and reused and recycled in these kind of cyclical sort of backlash or kind of reactionary events that kind of arise out of the end of pandemics. And I think I became really, really fascinated by this idea of vaccines, not as this quite unrelatable, I felt, story of just a genius having a genius idea, but actually as this kind of process of knowledge that had come from all over the world, and the smallpox vaccine essentially being the product of that. And then I began to get very frustrated, actually, with how I could see in anti-vax communities the way that new vaccines were being announced at the end of last year. Often I felt in a way that was supposed to prioritize, their medical and technical brilliance, to sort of show, how fantastic and brilliant they were and how cutting edge. But it almost felt as if it was further alienating the people who really needed to be reassured about this technology. All of this kind of emphasis on, what brilliant cutting edge science they were and stuff like that just wasn't cutting through. And in fact, it was making them more suspicious. So I sort of thought, it would be really good if someone could create a kind of history of vaccines that kind of looked at them as a social phenomena. And one that people could relate to, that, doesn't just come from kind of elite scientists and kind of ivory towers, but actually, has all of these kind of ramifications in ordinary people's lives. And I sort of did that thing of kind of hoping that someone was having the same idea and was in a better position to make it than me. And they didn't. And then I lost patience and thought, well, I'll make it myself then, because I think, this is an important way to look at vaccines, and particularly to kind of look at where the kind of emotional needs that vaccine skepticism often comes from, and a way to address that emotional need rather than simply just kind of debunking this claim, debunking that claim, which I think is really important work, but you will always be playing catch up because you're not speaking to, I think, the central kind of uncertainty that I think characterizes a lot of vaccine hesitancy.
I'm really, really curious about this. I mean, it seems like as long as there have been vaccines, and before that, early inoculation methods, people have been stridently opposed. It seems to be a sort of predictable phenomenon of social psychology. It goes back at least to the 1600s, as you talk about, and persists to this day. Just curious if you have thoughts about the historical reasons, and then how, in light of that, you make sense of anti-vax arguments today.
There are always conservatives, right? There are always people who, I think in the words of William F. Buckley, said they stand at the cusp of history and yell stop, or something like that, which I always thought was a lovely, lovely turn of phrase. And those people always exist. But I think sometimes the mistake can be to have this narrative of history in your head, which I think we all have, where it's all kind of just moving forward, right? And anybody who was standing at the cusp of history and yelling stop was therefore, just kind of bigoted, backwards, probably some kind of religious zealot, as so many were back then, that we couldn't comprehend their thinking, when that's actually not really true. One thing I find really interesting is how the battle lines along the process of kind of creating a vaccine are not, purely science versus religion or anything like that. There's, all sorts of kind of groups that, for whatever reason, I think will, disregard a new technology. They don't think it's important. In the case of, the early British Empire, it's actually quite ideologically important to them that inoculation isn't accepted as a practice, because that might mean admitting that, people in colonies such as India had thought of a technology before the British had.
Yeah, it's sort of this weird inversion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, people have all sorts of reasons, essentially, for, saying, I'm not sure about this new technology, or more often, I'm very against this new technology and I think it's really dangerous and needs to be, suppressed. And yeah, it's not always a simple case of, science marches forward and, everyone else just catches up.
Yeah, all the ignorant people are opposed to it somehow, right?
Do you know one of the reasons for hesitancy that you're flagging in your opening comments that I haven't actually considered, but it makes total sense once you say it, is that the rejection of the kind of flashy scientific, Tesla rollout of the mRNA vaccine, I think it might bring up amongst this community a kind of anti-consumerist nausea, actually. And in fact, as I'm thinking about some of the comments that probably I didn't read too closely in the Yoga Journal Instagram feed, there are a lot of references to rejections of the kind of consumerist world that Yoga Journal actually sells as part of its package of neoliberal wellness. And so those two issues, I hadn't really thought about it that way, is that it's not just that we're rejecting something unknown, but that we're tired of being sold things in very enthusiastic and flashy ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially by people you may not necessarily trust, right? I got very angry at this kind of glut of politicians who were all taking their photo ops holding the vaccine, they're kind of above their head and kind of peering at it and all of this sort of stuff. Because, obviously, if you're a politician, you can't not do it. It's such a fantastic photo. But I sort of thought, actually, who are you to kind of associate yourself with this technology, which many people are uncertain about, not to say they're necessarily anti-vax, but are uncertain about, and kind of try and market to them that way, do you know?
Yeah, it's the perfect intersection for conspiracy theorists of political power, financial motivation, and then, new technology that they don't necessarily trust.
And also just loathing, too, because depending upon the politician, this is the worst possible person to present it for the photo op.
There was a poll that was done this week asking anti-vaxxers in the U.S. if endorsements from politicians or celebrities they trust would change their mind, and the overwhelming majority said no. I don't know if there's anything similar to that in the UK, where there's just such a distrust where it doesn't matter. It actually turned them off if the politicians were holding them.
Yeah, I certainly think there can be. I mean, we don't have the same kind of, I think, associations with kind of Hollywood here, which I think can kind of change that.
That's good.
But I certainly think there is just the minute you touch it, you are associating it with that kind of that institution, right? And yeah, I think specifically in the US, where I think the vaccine debate is so really, really politically polarized, doesn't quite fall down the same lines here in the UK. I can really see why that would be the case.